Morning, year 2. It's Monday morning and it's time for story time today. So we pick up with the Littlest Viking. And if you remember, the children are having their good riddance to the garden party to try and make everyone realise how great the garden is and that they need to save the garden. And we've just got to the point where Amber's told the children about warriors and about the berserks, and they're going to try and make everyone want to keep the garden. Katie and Gary went back to their guests. "Well done for selling the garden, Dr. Atterton," said Katie, patting him on the arm. "Yes," said Gary, "it should make a nice bit of money for us all." The doctor eyed them over the top of his glasses. "It's terrible to see children thinking so much about money. In my day, we would have wanted to keep the garden and run about and play," scolded Dr. Atterton. "I think this is a disgrace, don't you, Mrs. Paling?" Old Mrs. Paling, who didn't hear very well, thought the doctor said she'd got a nice face, and she smiled. She hadn't had a compliment since the last blackout in the Second World War. She shyly took the doctor's arm and strolled off across the garden, agreeing with him. Meanwhile, Joshua and Amber snuck into the house to become berserks. They had some trouble finding bearskins to wear. As Joshua explained, nobody did that anymore because Mum belonged to something called Greenpeace, which said it was wrong. In the end, Amber settled for a pink bath mat tied around her middle, and Joshua wore the Thunderbird's rug from beside his bed. 2 of Mum's big saucepan lids did as shields, and Joshua insisted on putting the little rubbish bin from the bathroom on his head as a helmet. Ratatos joined in too by putting on a tea cosy and poking his head through the hole for the spout. The 2 tiniest Vikings and their squirrel companion set off for their mission. Mr. Gray was feeling very confident. He didn't care about the garden. He'd never played in one as a child, and now his bad hay fever meant he didn't want to go in one as a grown-up. He carefully gathered the papers for the sale into a small folder and tucked them under his arm. He wasn't particularly keen on going to the garden party, but it was the perfect opportunity to get everyone in the terrace to sign the sale papers. Nothing would stop him now. However, as Mr. Gray opened his front door, the strangest thing happened. From either side of the step, 3 terrifying creatures rushed at him, screaming and hollering like demented animals. They were no more than 3 feet tall, but the noise was terrible. One of them looked rather like a small boy wrapped in a fur spaceship, but the others consisted of nothing but an enraged bath mat and a lunatic tea cosy floating in midair. Mr. Gray ran inside and slammed the door shut. He blinked his eyes. "What's the matter, dear?" called his wife from upstairs, where she'd been kicking the tumble dryer. Nothing," stuttered Mr. Gray. He shook his head and decided that he really must have a holiday this year. Then he took a deep breath and opened the door again. The party was going well. By now, even Mrs. Marchmont had arrived and was actually chatting with some of her neighbours. Katie brought out the board of photographs along with Mum's camera. "I thought we'd take one last picture of everyone in the garden," she announced. Mrs. Marchmont fixed her with a glare and strode up to the board. "Where did you—" she began crossly, and then she caught sight of herself 50 years before in her wedding gown under the cedar tree. "Oh," she said, sighing, and her face softened. "I think Mrs. Marchmont just lost her troll hide," whispered Gary. At that moment, a great cry went up from the steps, and a small bath mat followed by a bedside rug and plastic rubbish bin pelted down the stairs and into the bushes, pursued by a furious Mr. Gray. He would have carried on chasing them, except that something, looking like a rabid tea cosy, bit his leg as he leapt off the last step. "What on earth?" cried Mum, who was now even more suspicious of the entire party. Mr. Gray sat rubbing his ankle. "Good riddance to the wretched garden," he muttered. "I've bought the papers for you all to sign. I think we should do it now." Everyone was silent. Mrs. Marchmont stepped forward. "I'm afraid I've changed my mind," she announced. "I no longer wish to sell." "Neither do I," said Dr. Atterton. "Nor me," added Mrs. Paling, who for once had followed the entire conversation perfectly. Strangely, not one of the owners wanted to sell any more. They all turned their backs on Mr. Gray and returned to the tea party. He limped around for a while, muttering about profit margins and seizing opportunities, but no one was interested, and he soon went home. Later, all the grown-ups in Westcliff Terrace took a short walk around the garden to enjoy the view. They watched the sun setting across Pegwell Bay before finally going back indoors. Of course, they didn't really explore the garden. If they had wandered behind the shrubbery to the clearing, they would have been very surprised at what they saw. For sitting beneath a mulberry bush was the littlest Viking, wrapped in a bath mat and singing ancient Norse songs of victory.